Please watch this video in full. If you watch no other videos made by me, please make it this one and the 6 other parts to my little scientific proposals series. You can find the playlist for all 7 of them, including this one, in the playlist tab of the channel. So, along with that, to address just some things, I feel I should. One, as of current, thank you for 151 subscribers. I'm very happy that hopefully all, if not most of those people actually give a damn about what I have to talk about and showcase. Oh yes, as well as 68 books. Yep, I thought of one more idea for a novella I want to write. So 68 books that I will be making at some point. No context to that, go watch my first video of me telling stories from my travels, which was 2 videos ago, and I guess also the last video I posted, exploring Ottawa Part 7. Not Ottawa, Laval. Exploring Laval. Neuromisattribution. What a bitch. As well as well, I'm not in the greatest of moods right now, so forgive me for being rather, I guess, seemingly overly stern and agitated. So, what is this video? Well, I mentioned first mentioned it in the last part of this little video series, Scientific Proposals Part 6, when I was in Gatineau, Quebec, that for Part 4 of this series, towards the end, when I talked about my theory in philosophy, ontology, of the paradox of existence, which, if you don't know what that is, I'll explain it briefly in a second, but I encourage you to go watch that video as well. I thought that I should do a bit more of an in-depth explanation of it. At the very least, or just at the very least, give quite a few more examples than I had initially given for that video. The reason it was so short of an explanation is because I hadn't finished typing out a paper copy for not just that theory, but all my theories, which I still haven't finished typing them out, but hopefully that'll get done either in Montreal or Longueuil. But also because strapped for time, I was getting ready to leave Ottawa and head into Gatineau. Because, well, yeah, that's when I had to get going. As well as I pulled an all-nighter to make those initial 5 videos of the scientific proposals of mine. But, so, those are the reasons why it wasn't as in-depth. But I'll try my best right now to explain it in a way that's cohesive and able to be grasped by anyone who attempts to engage in intellectual thought. But to start, I will just state the same notice that I had in that video. So, note, this proposed hypothesis is in no way a defense of or condonement of the actions of Slovenian psychoanalyst slash philosopher slash philosophical analyst Slavoj Žižek. As far as I'm concerned, he is a massive posturer. He's a manipulator. He most likely, in terms of psychological disorder, has Machiavellian personality disorder and or attention-seeking personality disorder or histrionic personality disorder. He's very eccentric. He's very eccentric as well. I would claim that he may even have a heavy eccentric behavioral traits leaning towards maybe disorder. But he's highly manipulative. And I consider him to not actually be genuinely a leftist, as far as I'm concerned. He tries to obtain mass amounts of praise from the far leftist community to, in terms of my redesign of the political spectrum, political fi slash political fe, far leftist to rising leftist community. He panders to them, and he also he tries to just obtain social commendament from them. So, but that being said, despite the fact that I don't believe that he actually believes in the morals that he claims to hold ethically, I do still think that his work, in terms of what he highlights in his analysis, in his psychoanalysis work, and also in philosophy, I believe is incredibly beneficial and has a lot of merit to it. I know there are many on the leftist community who, or amongst those of leftist intellectuals, might think otherwise, but as far as I'm concerned, he does genuinely have valid points to what he is trying to, well, what he's performatively getting across. So, I just thought I'd state that, just a little notice. It's not a defense of him. So, what is my theory, or, well, technically in this relation, it's not solely also just mine. Technically, the idea has been proposed before, but I thought I would, in this form, outline it more definitively, at least in a way that I could understand. What is the paradox of existence? Well, I submit the following conclusion that in ontological examination, the entirety of our known reality, the spaces that we exist within, our mortal lives, and our, in terms of our metaphysical and physical interactions between one another, our feelings of connection in psychology, and just the general fabric of reality as a whole, is 100% in and of itself completely contradicting in every possible facet. And it's not particular to one element of the known world more than another. It's not well, it's not a bias paradox in any possible way to a demographic of people, a sector of scientific study, or a method of enactment of something. It is, as far as I'm concerned, though I may not be able to fully describe it as well as it is, at least as far as I've observed it to be, it's equal. It's completely egalitarian across the board for how it presents itself. This mass array of contradictions. And in this regard, before I actually go into giving examples of this, some of you who have, those of you who are amongst the philosophical discourse community, well, some of you who have very clearly realized this, whether you've openly expressed it or not, well, some of you might be rather dismissively or what's a good word for it? I'll say cynically right now, but I don't know if that's a very good way to describe it. Rather cynically, rolling your eyes at that, thinking, okay, so what? Yeah, I know life is, at its very essence, contrary to everything we really want out of it. So, but this isn't an issue. What's the problem with this? Like, people complain about those of the small communities scattered across the internet who might be talking about this. Well, there's really nothing you can do about it, so why bother even trying to combat it or talk about it or highlight it even further than it already has been? Well, to combat that rather unintelligent response, you might think that it means nothing, that life is contradicting. Well, in reality, as far as I'm concerned, it's another example of how we are all just basically doing the same thing for almost the same purposes. Well, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to psychobiology, we all have the innate 5 same subconscious desires, just on the most basic level. But it basically means that if you have a complaint of something, to some degree, which as far as I'm concerned is valid in what we can describe, even then, you're just doing the same thing as your assailant or your let's say your oppressor. You're doing the same thing in essence. So it matters with relation to linguistics and philology how we orient our wording. So it relates to semantics as well, because you're going to claim that it doesn't matter and just say, whatever. Well, you better be prepared, as far as I'm concerned, to just shut your mouth when a problem for you arises. Because to get angry at it, well, you know what? Let me just get into the examples. I think I'll start with more minor things this time, and then gradually go into more existential territory. So, what can I use as an example? Oh, and also, if I pause the video's recording just to think about it repeatedly, deal with it. That's that. Sorry about it. What could I use as an example? Okay, let's go with my clothes. So, most of us would argue that fashion, clothing, attire, is just something we use to, okay, in a cultural context, it's what we use to represent or express things related to our practice traditions, our people group, our societal surroundings, things that we've become accustomed to on a cultural level for aesthetical appeal, basically. And then on the just on an axiological level, its only value is basically to just cover your body, just to either conceal what's part of your physiological self, and also for protection from the weather environments of, well, your external surroundings. So this is what most people would probably agree upon. At least, well, if you're thinking about it. Or at the very least, even if you don't fully agree with the latter stance that I took there, you might think, well, clothes are just a common part of life. But regardless, what we can all agree on is that we just put them on. They're not parts of our actual selves, at least not physically. Or are they? In relation to this, so let's talk about in terms of like expressionism. If I'm using my clothes, let's say, in a cultural context, to express experiences that I've gone through in terms of what's maybe more thematically appealing to me, or from what has been known in my cultural surrounding, whether because of traumatization or because of indoctrination or because I've critically thought about it and I genuinely do feel that this is a beneficial expression for myself and part of my pro-socialization here. Whichever one, whatever causality, or a mix. In this regard, you're wearing something to express a metaphysical part of yourself, experiences that you've gone through. And if we relate this to psychology, the psychological state, the emotional state, the psyche, whatever you want to call it, our emotional well-being, our cognition, our intelligence. As far as I'm concerned, this could even be talked about in and of itself, which I'll probably do, but first let me keep on track here. We're going to regard these psychological states as being something that is metaphysically projected between people in the socializing setting, where we're interacting with one another, we're sharing our emotional experiences. As far as I'm concerned, our psychological state is controlled by our central nervous systems, cerebral cortex, and as well as the limbic system that process various emotional regulation. And the whole neurofunctionality of it is what determines our emotional well-being at whatever current point in time. And that's how this is projected between interactions of various peoples. And this is also what is the deciding factor in how we choose to behave, how we choose to act, how we choose to think, how we choose to how we exist. So in that regard, if you're utilizing clothes, fashion, to express something that has happened to you, and it's something that has lasted with you, or let's go with just say let's go with a less dark example. Let's just say pleasurable cultural attire from when you grew up in your cultural setting, your background, your heritage. Let's say you're wearing this to express your lineage of people, where you've come from, things of the sort. And as you're an adult now, or you're of an older age, you're wearing these various colors and fabrics or whatever clothing material it is to actually express experiences from your childhood. Something that has left an impression on you. Well, if it's left an impression on you, is this not technically physically a part of you? And in that regard, the clothes that you're wearing technically not a part of you as well if it is meant to actually express something that's happened to you. Because if they're representative of an incident that is lasting to you metaphysically, in an emotional sense, well then, as far as I'm concerned, your clothes could be considered a part of your physical self. Without them, or if you were to wear something that was, say, foreign to your cultural background, or the foreign to your traditional style of dress attire, willingly or unwillingly, well, then this is not actually something that is representative of you and therefore not a part of you. It's something that, in terms of forceful cultural annihilation, could be seen as branding you accordingly with your oppressor. So there's that one, there's that example. What's another one? Okay. Wood. Let's go with that. So right now, I'm underneath a wooden canopy in a public park in the city of Laval, Quebec. And, well, it's got wood beams along here. I'm sitting on a, well, either this is a wooden made picnic table that's been coated with some sort of plastic coating, or it's made plastic. But okay, let's just go with the beams. Let's go with the wooden beams. Let's go with dead wood, chopped down wood in general. Now, most people would consider something like this, like a wooden beam. I'm not pointing at this one because that one's metal. A wooden beam to be an inanimate object. We'd consider it just to be a non-living thing that is holding up this, is supporting the structural integrity of this canopy or whatever else, of any other building structure that is made of wooden material of some kind. And but we would agree in dendrology, study of trees and tree life, that tree is a living organism. And I brought up a similar example to this in part 4 of my proposals, so I'm not really going to bring it up again. But we would agree that it's a living organism. It's a part of the natural vegetation life that grows, and it provides fresh oxygen to the surrounding environment for various other animal species to breathe. So, and harness, and also provides various benefits to the other plant life and the ecosystems around it, if it's not an invasive species, depending on where on the globe it is. But once, so it's a living organism that has cellular systems and structures within its compounds that provide its resources to sustain its life, specifically through root functions growing within the ground to absorb, say, water nutrients from the soil. or in, yeah, yep, trees go through photosynthesis, I think. I know trees get energy from the sunlight. I think that's also referred to as photosynthesis in dendrology. I'll have to look that up. But regardless, they get energy from the sun and from the water molecules within the ground and the soil. So we agree that it's a living organism, most of us, I would say. Maybe Reddit has something to say about that, I don't know. But I don't give a damn one way or another. But once we cut that tree down and we process it, we convert it into, let's say we convert it through machines and break it down into various wood planks or splits of wood, if we split wood, and then we mold it, saw it, etch it in whatever ways to make, let's say, furniture out of it. Furniture structure. The structure for leather or some sort of cushioning material to go over it. Or something like this. Just turn them into beams with maybe a bit of a sealing coating on it to just protect it from weather damage. Once we've done that, most of us, I think, would agree that the tree is now dead. We've killed it. As far as I know, trees don't have, if it's large enough damage, it doesn't have much cellular regeneration ability, but we've cut it down, this large tree, and it's now just, it's been turned into, in various, wherever it's been redistributed, it's been turned into an inanimate object. But most people, I don't think, would believe that, or at least they wouldn't agree with, in the traditional context of most language definitions in terms of wording, that these wooden planks are a corpse, a dead organism. Maybe even, depending on what we're counting plant life as, a dead animal. Because, well, now it's been converted into furniture material support for just the integrity of whatever it's keeping in place, right? Well, why not? By all definitions, at least as far as I'm concerned, what do we regard a dead organism as? A corpse, cadaver, whatever you want to call it. Well, I would think it'd be agreed upon, at least in most of the scientific community, that a dead organism is something that once had sustainable life force that has now ceased, that is no longer within functionality. Its systems have been destroyed to a fatal extent. So, but in that regard, these wooden beams would, I think, constitute as a dead organism, a non-living organism that is passed on. Quite more so, have been murdered. And in that regard, actually, it's a little bit morbid, considering the fact that this, by all accounts, technically dead organism of what is no longer living, but had a living, sustainable life force before, in terms of its structural compounds on a cellular level, is surrounded by members of its own, well, plant species, or, well, its species of what it once was, considering the fact that, well, we're in a public park. So, by all accounts, aren't these wood planks that are making up the entirety of the structure here pretty well of this canopy? Is this not the dead corpse of one or various former living organisms? By that regard, it's well, it's a dead, maybe we could count as an animal, depending on, well, definitions of the animal kingdom. So there's that one. It's another. Oh, actually, on the same topic of corpses, dead non-living organisms, but dead organisms that were once alive. Let's go with a dead human being or other animal species. So, I think in contemporary society it would be agreed upon that that a dead human being is someone whose consciousness and autonomic system functionality, cardiovascular system, digestive tract, cognitive process, pulmonary function, they've all shut off. They've all been fatally damaged, destroyed to the extent that they are no longer, their, well, consciousness and their self is no longer a part of the material world. And in this, we most often, at least in terms of what we consider to be dead organisms, agree that a titular trait of them is that they are non-moving, or at the very least, well, technically, there are animal species that can still move after death to some degree because of reactions or final reactions of the peripheral nervous tissue, and muscular functionality. But in this regard, or by all accounts, we would agree that we consider something that's dead, say a human being, to not be alive. Obviously, right? That sounds like, a no-brainer. Something was alive, now it's dead, so therefore it's not alive anymore. But in this regard, let's look at the deteriorative process of a human corpse. So, when we die, and nutritional compounds are no longer being flooded into our structural mass, our cells begin to degenerate. Skin cells begin to erode, same with neural tissue, bone structure in the bone marrow. The arteries begin to deteriorate. All the cell compounds within our bodies begin to start getting destroyed. They start breaking down. And this is a natural reaction of the cell compounds within our bodies. And a part of this as well, in relation to this, bacterium, at least let's say in corpses that are beginning to rot, bacterium begins to form that would that'll eat away at the actual structural mass of our bodies as the breakdown process begins. Because, well, I'm not entirely versed in the exact process of it, but I know obviously for the entirety of the body that is. But point being, we begin to break down in this essence, this process. But seeing as this is a natural reaction of the dying cells, and these bacteriums are forming because of the deterioration itself to help further aid in the breakdown of our actual body structures, then does this technically not mean that we are still alive to some extent? If the bacterium, for most of it, is formed out of the decay of our actual physical structures, well, does that not mean that the bacterium technically came from and is a part of us? It's what is forming, being birthed out of the rotting process. So in this regard, it's a part of our physical bodies, the ones that are starting to decay. So if we regard this in this regard as coming from our physical selves, then how is this not us to some degree, in some facet, still being alive? Because we think, well, sure, but it's formed after our consciousness has ceased. So technically not. What your personality was and who you were as a person, whatever you had believed before, your cognitive state, your actions, all that is completely ceased. So it's in terms of what we regard as being a person on a existential level, and psychologically what our personalities entail. No, this isn't correct. You're not alive still. Okay, yes, obviously not in that regard. We're not alive, who we technically were. But if we're going to count the entirety of our physical and metaphysical selves, our physiology and our psychology, as being one, as far as I'm concerned, then in relation to our physiology, I don't know how many people know this, well, obviously it's part of gastroenterology, our digestive tract is full of bacteria. It's full of living organisms that are these various little, I think they would be counted as, well, actually maybe not an amoeba, but, well, bacterium that's within our digestive tract to help break down the actual food that is being consumed by us to sustain our life, as it's to aid the process of absorbing nutrients through the, I believe it's the cilia is what they're called for the, it's the tentacle looking things on an anatomy diagram of our intestines. So we already have bacterium within us that formed as we grew. I don't believe maybe it's present at birth, but one way or another the bacteria begins to further form as we grow. So therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it's part of our physiology, and it formed from us. And the same thing goes for in regards to sexology, and more specifically in relation to gynecology. This is actually an interesting thing that I just learned recently in gynecological studies that I had researched. That apparently there is bacterium that actually, healthy bacterium that forms within the vaginal tube that actually acts as a protectant to help keep the, well, inner vulva, specifically the vaginal tube, going up to the actual uterus, clean. It's actually there to help protect against harmful bacterium and also just harmful pathogens that could cause disrupt to the inner tissue of the actual tube's lining, as well as and actually, interestingly enough, that is what causes the titular, more fishy odor that's associated to, just vaginal health, or it could be, say, discharge from the vaginal opening. That's actually what forms the odor, is the buildup of bacterium. This beneficial bacterium that is meant to help keep pathogens out and keep it as sterile as possible. So again, this is something, these are bacteriums, life forms that have formed within us. So it's a part of our physiology as far as I'm concerned. So in this regard, and on top of that, we have various microorganisms living all across our bodies on a daily basis that are, well, too small to see. Some of them, I believe, form for the actual protection of our, say, skin, or I believe there are actually some around our eyelids that are helpful in protecting against harmful debris. So if we're going to regard these things, and back to dead corpses, if we're going to regard these things as being a part of our physiology that forms within us, and if this bacterium that helps in the cellular breakdown after we have died and begin to decay away, well, then technically we are still alive, just on a physical level. We still have a part of what is formed from within our physical structures that is living. And if you think about it, in the breakdown process, as most often in unpreserved corpses, maggots begin to form, and various other maggots, and I don't think it's not earthworms. There's worm type animals begin to form out of the decay. Then flies, as they metamorphosize, as they go through the process of metamorphosis. And as well as that, other flies, these flies that could have formed out of our decaying bodies, oftentimes they'll go towards other deteriorating masses, maybe other living organisms, such as other animals that are dying off and decaying. And in this way, technically, a part of us has now become another living being. Flies around us, the little bugs. So, are we still technically not alive after death? In that regard, at least? Okay, I know I said it would start off with maybe a few more simple examples, but don't think that's really possible now that I'm actually saying these out loud. What's another one? Okay, here's one. This one of the last ones that I guess will be simpler-ish if you're following my logic already. It's the last one I'll give, and then I'll ramp it up a notch, I guess, to more worldview shattering portions of, well, examples that I could give. So, books. We all know books, most of us. They're a form of literary medium that is used for entertainment, for research documentation, for just general education purposes, in entertainment, artistic creation to tell stories, or even just really not books, just written material in general, filed documents, just a note written on a piece of paper, or one word, just one word on a sticky note, whatever it may be, written language that we can visually see. Well, most people would regard this. So let's say I'll jump to the example of just, let's say you're reading a book and you're just relaxing, enjoying it, and you're taking in, well, word by word, in terms of your neuroocular senses, interpretation of the words that are written out. Let's just say for these purposes you don't have any sort of visual impairment, or don't have any sort of neuroocular impairment in terms of reading interpretation of, like, say, like if you had dyslexia, or what's another one? Let's say you don't have any sort of major impairments to that, for this example. So you're reading the book, you're enjoying it, and if someone were to ask you what you're doing, you would obviously most likely respond with, well, I'm reading a book. I'm reading it. But if, let's say, if they were some invasive stranger who's just walking up to you in the corner of the library and inquiring about, no, tell me in exact detail what you are doing, absolutely 100% describe what you are physically and metaphysically doing right now, someone like me, if that happened to you, if it does, I'm sorry for you, that must be a horrible experience. Could you... I'm sorry, that was too stupid even for me. Okay, let's say you then describe the entirety of what you're doing, and you say, I am using my visual senses to follow along with the described wording of the literary work that's typed out on, let's say, like a typewriter of some kind, or digitally typed out, that has been printed off for me to interpret through my visual process and enjoy. That's what I'm doing. But there's the key thing there, is visual process. So, where I'm going with this is, if we're gonna, so what do we define like reading as? Is just you're following a scripture of some kind, a bit of text, and you're tracing it with your eyes, your ocular senses, to interpret it for your semantic memory and just your knowledgeable understanding of what is being expressed on the page. But if we were to actually examine that in terms of how we go about doing that, are you not technically watching the book? So in this regard, like watching in the same way as you would watch a film or a television show, or watching, say if you were playing a video game, you're playing the game using a controlling device to manipulate the character's movements and actions. But you're also visually watching what is happening on the screen or your device, whatever it may be, for what is going on in the actual level, or if it has a cutscene of some kind, whatever is going on in the animation. So these are all, we could agree, I guess, just you're watching what's going on. You're following it visually. But so if we look at the neuroscience behind this, as far as I'm concerned, when you're watching any sort of entertainment piece or just anything out and about using your senses controlled by the occipital lobe at the back portion of the cerebral structure of your brain, which is what controls our ocular and auditory senses primarily, well, you're taking in something visually that is being displayed to you, and through connections of synapses in the brains and the axons, transmitting the gained visual information to your memory banks in terms of what's associated mainly to the temporal occipital regions of the brain, helps in encoding memory formation, especially in relation to what there's proof of it being in relation to dream process, like if we were to fall asleep and actually having dreams, more obviously in deep sleep dreams more so, that are a way of helping to encode memory into the hippocampus functionality, and also the prefrontal cortex for our remembrance. Well, this is all the same, as far as I'm concerned, for the visual interpretations of reading a set of scripture. You're using your ocular senses to trace the words, and from gathered semantic memory, you're relaying your knowledge of each word that is typed out to in terms of frontal cortex functionality, to a conceptual idea that is associated to the word, to what you associate a piece of information with in terms of a definition of a word, as what that word is used in the language to correlate to the meaning of something. to what it means, basically. So, in all this, if you're using your ocular senses to have this visual interpretation for the process of, well, conceptual knowledge and also for your stored memory information, the same way as it would be for you relaxing and taking in what is being displayed to you via a screen, say as like this video here is to you, or a film, a show, or a comic book, if we want to say like a graphic novel, well, then in this regard, all these different entertainment devices, or these things that we're visually looking at, well, they all have the same neuroocular process as far as I'm concerned, as far as science is, as far as neuroscience is concerned, and also optometry. But so if we're going to define something as, say, you're watching something because of this visual interpretation, this input that you're getting cognitively from what is displayed to you, well, then how is this not the same for reading? Because in all essence, you're just inputting words, you're visually looking at these words, these written structures that are in correlation to a definition of something, of what we conceptually know to be, well, summed up in just this word for whatever given language as an expressive tool for our communication. How are you not watching the book then? And technically, if we're going to go the opposite route, if, say, we're using the same sensory input process to interpret these various external stimuli, the various external stimuli around us in regards to what I'm talking about here, then we could even pull a vice versa and say, you're not technically reading a film, a show, a video game, a play, a theatrical live play, or a music video. Are you not technically, I guess, in the way we're describing it, reading it or watching it? So, are you not doing the same thing in terms of your process of interpretation for this? Okay, so let's go into a bit more of a, let's move on to let's just progress into more striking, or maybe even to some disturbing examples. Because before this, I don't think like all the examples I've given so far would be considered really perspective, belief shattering or disruptive to anyone's ideologies or philosophies of life. Well, let's go further into that territory. So, let's say okay, let's use the example of you're in school, whatever country it is, it doesn't matter, just whatever the grade system it is. Let's say it's what's considered high school level. Let's say it's secondary schooling level in terms of what is typically referred to in various educational systems around the world as secondary, no matter what age range it may be for the set nation that they integrate students into the program at, or as I like to call it, the indoctrination machine. Let's say you're in high school and you're being bullied, you're being harassed by Strong John Jimmy. Let's call him that, Strong John Jimmy. He's a notorious bully in the school, and he's got a skull t-shirt on. He's got spiked wristbands. He's Buford from Fairly Odd Parents, and I'm just describing it in different. I'm just trying to describe it in a different way. I just realized I was about to rip off. Buford's design here. Okay. Let's say you're just being bullied. That was also pretty offensive, probably, to any of those who are part of the punk rock community, who affiliate with punker culture. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to mean in any degrading way. But anyway, okay. Let's say you're being bullied by this person. They're slamming you into lockers. They're smacking food out of your hand during lunchtime. They're taking your skull and shoving it into the bathroom mirror till it breaks, and then getting shards of glass stuck in your face, in your skin, to a point where you would actually have to be rushed to the ER. I think that would probably count as a little bit more than bullying there if that happened, but, or at least what's traditionally, unfortunately, considered that. But let's say this is that you're being bullied, and you then you go and talk to the principal of the school, let's say, about this, or the vice principal, or whoever else, or a school counselor, if they have one, if they provide one. And then they call you and Bully Boy in to, like, have a talk, basically. And okay, actually give me a second. I actually want to think about this. I'm trying to think of like a good scenario that would constitute as contrary here. Hold on. Okay, got a bit of an idea here. So you're in the principal's office. The both of you have been called in to try and talk this out. And so in the bullying process, it's highlighted that, well, what your adversary has been doing to you. Harassing you constantly, say they've been degrading you verbally, they've been physically abusive towards you, and all around been causing you mass disrupt to your daily school activities, your life, and they've been dehumanizing you on pretty well every level. And in this, so they've, and all this has been going on unconsensually. Obviously, it's not like you had asked for whatever reasons. If, let's say, this obvious scenarios, let's say you obviously haven't asked for this. You've never verbally, or you've never in any way communicated that, hey, I would like to be made fun of, and I would like to be degraded, and I would like to be humiliated, basically. But you've never asked this person for this, and you've never, for whatever reasons, if you did, whatever the reasons behind you doing so would be, you haven't. It's just, that's obvious in what I'm describing, right? But, so you haven't asked to be mentally berated constantly to a point that it's disrupting your life in a detrimental way, I would argue. But nonetheless, you never asked to be psychologically abused in this way by this person. And in doing this, you're telling your bully about all this, like that this is what it's causing. They're very much sociopathic behavior and very aggressive actions. And you're, say, obviously you're not, well, maybe you are, but let's say you're not using proper psychological terminology and you're just saying you're being a complete scummy douchebag to me, and let's say the conversation gets a bit heated, and maybe the principal and the vice principal are just trying to cool it down a bit. But basically, your bully is obviously not agreeing with you and is defensive about their moral choices for what they believe is socially acceptable to do. Well, in this regard, let's look at this. So you obviously didn't ask to be psychologically berated in this way at all. But just the same, the bully has been called into the office to have a dialogue with you. An instance where you're basically telling them everything that's wrong with them emotionally. They're very much psychologically traumatized, and how their actions are affecting you. Basically, all around, how much of a terrible person they're being. And you were in agreement with the school staff, with the administrative members of the school, to basically agree to have this meeting. You're in condonement of it. You morally condone the actions of talking this out. But in this regard, your bully didn't consent to this. Like, let's say, obviously, is what's traditional in a lot of westernized schooling. And from what I know in certain regards, obviously in various, it's a part of various schooling tactics in various countries, but it's very common in the Western world to forcefully, like, demand that someone who is being an aggressor to someone else come here or do this, or basically force them to have this something of this sort of like a talk of some kind with whoever they're defaming and diminishing. So, but in this regard, that's still not consentful. So, in essence, are you not condoning the unconsentful nature of causing this person to be psychologically, in essence, berated, whether for a beneficial or detrimental means? You're still, at the end of the day, condoning an unconsentful emotional I don't want to say, well, yes, it's a self-reflection, but an unconsentful emotional and a purposely enacted mental beratement of who they are as a person. And in essence, you're pretty well doing the same thing that your bully was doing to you. They were dehumanizing you to a mass extent without your consent and emotionally abusing you and physically. Now, minus the physical part, you're essentially unconsentfully berating them because obviously they don't like it. This feels threatening to them, to their sense of self, their sense of identity, most likely, to their typical projection of personality and persona and general behavior socially. So this is something that's disrupting their wants or how they are as a person at that moment in time. So are you not technically doing the same thing to some degree that your bully was doing to you? And I'm not, in this regard, I'm not arguing whether it's more beneficial or detrimental. I would obviously say, in this regard, discussing this and telling them how this is morally inept completely, and how, as far as I would describe it, they are very psychologically damaged to be doing this. It's very antisocial. I would argue that is for a beneficial means, provably. But regardless, in the most basic of essence, I'm still technically doing the same thing to them. Okay, so there's that example. Well, it's another one. Okay. Let's say let's say that you're at a family gathering, and everyone is getting along well enough, and you're all just talking amongst each other, eating food, having drinks, practicing various, whatever the cultural traditions you practice are being enacted, and well, obviously this is a part of cultural traditions. But at the same time, family members are coming in and out, or like some are coming for the actual event, like just arriving, and then there are those who are leaving. And let's say you're one of the guests that's just arriving at whatever member of your family is hosting the event. Let's say that one of your family members is very excited and very perky to see you. They're very joyful, and they are like, "Hey, how's it going? It's great to see you," and you're feeling the same. And they say they kiss you on the cheek 2 times, on both cheeks, or they give you a kiss on the lips, just quickly as a friendly greeting. And this is just something that's been common when greeting your family members just throughout your whole life. And this time as well as every other time, you've never actually given, at least to your recollection, you've never given verbal or really any sort of physically well, I guess, technically, I guess, debatable. Yeah, you were being very joyful and very grateful to see them. But regardless, you never gave any sort of indicated consent to be kissed. And even amongst your family members. But it's something that's just been common as a friendly greeting or gesture amongst your family's practices. Well, if we look at this in its basic essence, is this not technically sexual assault? When we look at this in terms of just, well, its physical implications, you're forcing in some way, even if they weren't apprehensive to it, you are taking the authority of yourself and making your own complete decision without really the input other than the metaphysical input of like just the atmosphere of the surrounding gathering, or just what is common culturally frequently amongst your family. Other than this, you're not also on a metaphysical basis. You're not taking in like their genuine input. You're not taking in like verbal word communication. You're not taking in any account other than like, well, this is common for us to do, so I'm going to do it. On your own sole judgment, without any other indicating input, really. At least as far as I can detect. So, in this regard, you've, on your sole authority, taken it upon yourself to just decide on your own to be physical with them, in terms of that friendly intended gesture, yes, not in any way intended to be malicious. It was benevolent. But regardless, solely your decision, with no real other input. So, in that regard, of you forcing yourself onto them in that instance, how is this not technically rape? Because what do we define? Okay, now let's look at what most commonly, traditionally, is defined as sexual assault. Both in, depending on your ideological politics, well, this can vary depending on your area of the political phi, but one way or another, I think it's typically agreed upon, at least just on the most surface level of judicial understandings, that sexual assault is any sort of physical enactment that is unconsentful / unconsensual to a person or persons within any given social setting, whether it be in a sexually charged environment or not. So, like that I think that's fair to say that's agreeably the most bare bones definition of predatory sexual behavior. Or if we want to go further into, say, like sexual harassment or misconduct, engaging in verbal or sexual implications towards someone who is unwilling and unwanting of that enactment in whatever context. So I think that's generally agreed upon, just from that wording alone. Whether or not, unfortunately, people will disagree on situations that constitute as that, but regardless, just the wording alone, I think most people would just on average agree with my little description there. But so when going upon, like, looking at, well, it's defined as being an unconsentful physical act that is enacted upon someone else from another person or persons doing this to whoever else, that it's not communicated in any sort of real way with whether physical, well, whether metaphysically communicated in terms of the process of language and communication, or the much more iffy territory of reading the room, as I'll call it. Whether or not it's... what's my wording here? Really? Wow, that was fucking convenient timing. That's disgusting. Speaking of predatory acts, I have no clue who did that or where that came from. Probably somewhere back there, I can't tell. thought there for a sec. Okay. Point being, in a metaphysical context, what we define as metaphysical, anything that's, let's say, it's not communicated in whatever instance, whether it's verbal or body language, or it's emotionally, atmospherically communicated, whatever way it would typically go about. It's not communicated well here. It's really just a quick show of affection from this family member of yours. So it's not expressed in a sort of really affirmative, like, in any sort of way. It's not really a yes to, like, this, to agreeing to this. You get what I'm saying? So, by all this definition, your family member technically just assaulted you. Not maliciously, but either way, that's still in essence what it was. If that's what we generally define as being a problematic, unconsentful act, then that's, by all definitions, what that is: a forceful act that you did not fully agree to. Like, in terms of, I guess, maybe to add to this bit of like a scenario I'm trying to drum up here, let's say it kind of surprised you, like when they did it, even if it was quick, but you weren't apprehensive to it, but it surprised you. Like, you weren't for it, but you weren't against it. You weren't apprehensive. You were just kind of in the moment. Let's just go with that, and it kind of shocked you, not in like a disbelief, because you know this is typical of your family members, but it wasn't something that you were very much expecting. So to add to this, you're not playing into like the uncommunicated atmosphere of the environment and wanting of this interaction, let's say, even though you are very joyful to see them, you're very happy. So by this definition, as far as I'm concerned, how this is technically, by all essence, sexual assault from your family member to you. It's a sexual, because kissing is sexual. It can be a show of affection, can be sexual, where you're displaying this joyful means of pleasure between you and another person, of how happy you are to be near them, and you engaged in a physical action with them, but it was at the helm of your own control, really, your own decision without their input. So that's, by all definitions, as far as I'm concerned, in essence, the same thing. Okay? Maybe I didn't explain that one as well as I could have, or I thought I would have been able to. But moving on, let's go to another one. I'm actually going to take off my backpack because that's getting heavy. Surprisingly, there's not near as much in this new backpack as there was in my old one that was stolen. Don't fall, please. Speaking of which, my phone is dying, so while I come up with another example, let me just plug it in real quick. Hold on a minute. I just thought of two very, very good ones, I think. Very, very kind of disturbing, but two very good ones. So, let's bring it back. I know I used the example of a book as an earlier one, but let's just go with the idea of story writing, fiction writing, in terms of fictional creation of a world that you're writing. For, excuse me, for, let's say you're writing the plot outline for the story of a play. Let's say you're going to be putting on a theatrical play at a theater of some kind, and you're crafting in its original work by you as a playwright, and maybe you're co-writing the screenplay with someone else as well. But in terms of the story itself, you're solely writing that. Regardless, you're writing this story. You're creating it for the purposes to be put on as an entertainment medium and artistic project, something that's expressed in terms of artistic creation. And let's say you're also, for the context of this scenario, you're also an atheist. You don't believe in any sort of higher power. Oh, actually, let's run with the atheist one for a bit, but also I'll bring in the example that you could be religious too. But regardless, atheist or religious, let's start with the atheist example first. That you don't believe in any sort of omnipotent being, you don't believe in any sort of higher creator, and you don't have any sort of, you don't believe in any sort of, I guess more of a standardized atheist would be any sort of a life after death. You don't believe in any sort of afterlife or the consciousness of our cerebral projection and things of the sort, of our essence once we're gone. But in this regard, so what you're doing, so you don't believe in any sort of omnipotent beings that can manipulate and have a deciding factor over the creation and sustainability of our material and metaphysical world. So, but what you're doing, in essence, in terms of your writing, you're creating a fictional universe that's detailing the timeline of events of characters that you've created. You've molded their livelihoods in the story, the fictional universe that you're crafting. And you are, for these characters and these events, the events that occur as well in the storyline of your plot that you're writing, you are the sole crafter of what is being detailed for these characters. And you created the character, of course, external influences from people who have given you tips on the writing, or your co-writer for the screenplay has thought maybe this could happen as an event in it. So obviously things have influenced your decisions for writing material and inspired you. But in this regard still, you are the... I'm sorry, there's a mite in that. Okay. Oh, you might be a baby earwig. Oh, either way, it was crawling across my phone. Anyway, so you're the sole, in this regard, crafter of this fictional universe. So in examining this, this is a world that is being brought to fruition in the realms of a I don't know what the proper word would be for it in terms of theoretical physics, but not a parallel universe. Obviously, you're not creating a parallel universe, but you're creating sort of this parallel representation of either reality or of experiences that you've known of or had, and you're translating them through your ideas into this writing formats and creating this world. So you're creating this sort of you're creating a parallel. I don't know the word for it. I don't think any word I'm trying to use to describe it is really going to do it justice. You're creating this parallel, I'll just refer to it as this parallel fictional state. You're creating this state where these characters and events inhabit this realm, this fictional realm that you're bringing into fruition. So, in essence, does this technically not mean that you're, to some degree, in the context of the fictional detailings of this world, are you not technically a god? Some degree, at least? In what is defined as an omnipotent being. Well, what's omnipotence? Having total or complete power over a force of some kind, having complete divine control over the creation process, ongoing process, or halting, just stopping of something, destruction of something. So, in this instance, if that's what omnipotence is defined as, something that can be structured by and controlled by a all-supreme being, as in regards to an omnipotent being, or say something that's being played out, written out, in terms of a series of events that is dictated to occur, well, then as the writer, are you not technically the god of this world that you're crafting? Because you have complete control over what is created in this world, as well as obviously the other crew members who are involved in creating the fictional story, bringing it to life. But regardless, one way or another, you're all, and specifically you are still at the helm of it. So in this instance, are you not the god of these characters, having complete deciding control over every event that occurs within their fictional world, within this world of metaphysics that is either mirroring reality in some way, because as far as I'm concerned, even if it was a fantasy genre play of some kind, or it was a world that was meant to be vastly different than human construction and human behavior, in terms of how we interact socially. Well, as far as I'm concerned, being written by a human being, it's not, whatever genre it is, even if it's trying to be that, you're not going to get rid of that element, because you quite literally can't if you don't have any other knowledge of how the existence of other beings is. You could potentially understand it, but you will ultimately always have some element of what is a part of your familiarized settings, as far as I'm concerned, added into whatever you do. It's part of our 5 inherent human desires. But in regards to this, either way, mirroring one world with another in terms of fictional writing, by all accounts, you are the sole creator of these characters, and you're the deciding factor of what occurs within their fictional livelihoods and the events that take place within the set fictional world. So by that context, if we're going to describe omnipotence in relation to a religious god of some kind as, well, being that, then that is technically what you are if you're, well, involved in this, like writing a story of some kind. And even if you were religious, if you weren't an atheist, if you were a religious believer of some kind, believed in spirituality to some degree, expression of spirituality, then even then you might, though not regard your writing material as wholly spiritual in terms of omnipotence, having control over a set, over a metaphysical building of events within this parallel fictional reality. So, there's that. Now for the second one, which so I'm going to bring up the last 4 examples, I think. One of them will just be a reiteration of one that I talked about the last time that I explained the paradox of existence. But I'll just explain in, I think, a bit more depth. I think I can. So, in ontology, as well as leaning into phenomenology in terms of the existence of human beings, let's take a look at and our psychological desires, how we propel our own choices. Let's take a look at the idea of free will in philosophy. So the idea of free will, well, what is it? It's the idea that human beings individually have the cognitive capacity for independent thought and choice, that we are ultimately the deciding factors over what we choose to do individually. And even though psychologically we are influenced by everything around us, as far as I'm concerned, we still ultimately use what is taken in terms of a neural input to our psychological states of our emotional development, and we then make choices in regards to these things that, well, determines how we socially interact. We make choices on a daily basis to do, well, whatever it may be. So therefore, in regards to what would be in philosophy as known as, well, it would be a part of a indeterminism, yes, indeterminism, that we have this ability to freely decide and choose what to do. Or do we? Because we think about it, as I've already stated. So in this regard, as far as I'm concerned, the entirety of humanity's existence, our decisions, our drive towards life is all controlled by our psychological state. More specifically, the subconscious. And in fact, actually, it's a perfect time to bring it out. I should have mentioned this actually at the beginning of the video as well. I recently finished redrawing, thankfully, all my previous diagrams I had for the initial scientific proposal videos, because they were sadly stolen whilst being here in the wall. But I've been able to redraw them, and I actually have added detail to some of the previous ones, as well as I've created 2 new ones. Those being for my psychosociological theory of the unempathic / unsympathetic cycle of conflict, and my neuropsychological / philopsychological / neurobiological theory of coming morality formation, which I'll show all my diagrams again later on. But in this regard, I'll bust out the main one that had been basically all other theories of mine, as far as I'm concerned, everything in human existence in relation to our psychology, well, or psychobiology, it all relates back to is, well, the process of the 5 inherent human desires, or 5 subconscious wants, interactive loneliness, and biologic thanatophobia. So, we'll just hold it up. I don't have the clipboard, obviously, as I did last time, so I'll just hold it up so that you can get a good enough look at it. And you can pause, so if I can hold it in places where there's no writing. Pause the video to read through it for yourself and analyze it. Okay, got that under control. So, in regards to this, we function on the basis of 5 subconscious desires as far as I'm concerned: meaning, control, understanding, uniqueness, and familiarity. This then leads to a subconscious sense of willingness, a drive to obtain fulfillment, that things that we think in our daily lives will fulfill and gratify our 5 subconscious desires, which then leads to a conscious, and the conscious psychological state leads to the emotional response of motivation. And this is what propels us to try and enact things and attempt to obtain fulfillment in our lives. Now, this can go, well, it can go one of 3 ways. Either you could obtain fulfillment for what you were initially driven to obtain, to gratify your 5 inherent desires, which will then lead to gratification and mutual satisfaction of the subconscious, as well as gratification of your conscious motivation. And if this is something that is a constant constant fulfiller for you, then I'm sure one possibility is that you'll keep going towards this thing to continuously try and fulfill yourself, or you will then gain an interest of something else, maybe if that has already been obtained for you, And then that will become your new drive via your motivational response. So basically, well, my stomach is really starting to hurt for some reason right now. Stomach ache. Maybe eating 3 donuts was not a good idea. So, anyway, another way it could go is that you come into, and this is the most likely scenario as far as I'm concerned with human interaction, is that you will come into external conflict with, well, something in your environment, which will then lead to a reaction from external stimuli to internal conflict amongst your psychological process, or because of previous experiences that you've had, it could maybe instill in the apathetic response doubt in you, which then again, internal process, leads to disrupt to your conscious sense of motivation, which then leads to the conscious response of apathy. And in this regard, this leads to a relay to your biologic thanatophobia, your inherent fear of death. Now, that fear of death exists, as far as I'm concerned, as a protection mechanism to sustain your life. It serves as a barrier to basically shield your wants, your 5 subconscious desires, your willingness towards life from complete and total cognitive, disarray. It basically serves to keep you from, in techno mumbo jumbo aside in psychology, it keeps you from giving up the second something doesn't go your way, basically. It keeps you propelled towards not just grabbing a gun and blowing your brains out the second that you're writing even something as small and insignificant as just writing a check mark on fill in the blank box and dropping your pen and you're like, oh damn it. It keeps you from not just completely giving up the second that instance didn't go the way you had perceived it to be going. And this can either lead to just repetitive disruption in just a general sense where it leads to general apathy, or it can lead to an abnormality, which is the formation of apathetic psychological disorders and conditions, which are much of the same as the motivational ones, but either way, it leads to psychological disorders forming because of a disrupt to what you had apparently expected subconsciously out of life or your current situation in life, which leads to the disrupt to pro-socialization as in respect to interactive loneliness in relation to the desires, the willingness, and your biologic thanatophobia. The interactive loneliness, it comes about of, you never being fully satisfied, no matter how much fulfillment you may obtain or not. Never being fully satisfied with, or never being able to truly express how you desire these 5 inherent things in life. Never being able to truly express it to the extent that you understand it within your own, psychological essence, within your own cognitive process, your own mentality, your thoughts. And, my intestines are not feeling good. And in relation to this, hold on a second. Yeah, I don't know what's causing that, so I'm just gonna try and power through it. So, as I was saying, as far as I'm concerned, this interactive loneliness is an attempt by the subconscious to cope with, potentially absolve, but I make a distinction in wording only because of, well, there's conscious attempts at absolving trauma, and, well, in relation to that, loneliness of consciously known, or conscious feelings of loneliness. So the only reason I make a distinction is because of that. But let's go with the word cope for now. Basically, it's an attempt by the subconscious to cope with, wow, I am really not feeling well. To cope with, the loneliness process. You know what? I'm going to try and find a washroom. Hold on a second. So, long story short, I went up the road to a bar to use the washroom. Thankfully, made it in time. Had a bit of diarrhea. I know, very lovely information. I was only there for maybe like 5 minutes. Took me about maybe 10 minutes to walk to the place, so no, actually not even that. It took me maybe like 5 or 6 minutes to actually walk to the place, then back. So maybe about 10 minutes in total I was gone from the park. My tripod was stolen. Yeah. The one I had purchased in Ottawa after my original one from Toronto broke. Great. Lovely, familiar feeling. Don't worry. This time, I'm not letting it get to me. The tripod was getting rusted anyway, and, well, it was starting to corrode in parts and become very, rickety. Still a good tripod. Gonna miss it, but fuck it. I've been getting along fine without it. I've barely been using it, actually, since I left Ottawa, so. Anyway, so, back to talking about these. I'll just quickly go over the other possibility of the motivational disorders, much the same as the apathetic. Well, basically, as far as I'm concerned, consciously, an individual can be so overfixated on their motivational response emotionally that it actually leads to disruption to their natural pro-socialization because of interactive loneliness in terms of, well, it disrupts their interaction with other human beings. And this is what I would refer to as the psychological disorders in association with motivation. So, yeah, there's that explanation. But in regards to that, the whole point of that was, as far as I'm concerned, all of this, the psychological state, is headed, including our desires and wants and our cognitive thought process and our intellectual capabilities, are headed by our neurocortexes in the central nervous system. It is controlled solely by the central nervous system, our cerebrums, and our limbic systems, the various, well, frontal cortex, prefrontal cortex, our hippocampuses for memory, in terms of our recognition abilities, parietal lobe, and situational recognition, as well as the temporal lobe and regulation of judgment and anger, and also focus and attention is highly active in that region of the brain. Striatum in the limbic system for pleasure, hypothalamus for well, energy resources, but also for projection of consciousness in relation to the particular activating system in the brainstem. The amygdala, control of fear and anxiety, and our hypervigilance in terms of our reactionary response time, all the rest. So in regards to this, if we really look at this, so if we were to agree, and I'm speaking for as far as I'm concerned, but for those who agree with me, that the psychological state, our emotional Control is headed by our neurocortexes. Well, by this understanding, this technically, to some degree, means that we really don't have free will. Now, let me explain. I do think in this, because if we look at it, yes, the psychological elements of the neural connectivity within the brain structure, this is what makes up who we are as people. This makes up our personalities and our personifications, our mental cognitive thought process, our behavioral traits and tendencies that we enact. It makes up our ability to recognize and understand our philosophies and moral judgments within life. And also, it is what controls our intellectual and critical thought capabilities in terms of analytical observation. All this is what makes up who we are as people. And yes, as far as I'm concerned, psychological issues and our cognitions as a whole we can get a grasp on methods to mitigate or control issues being caused by them, or actively try and change elements that we have formed to have with, well, cognitive awareness and, well, self-awareness in that regard. That's, well, that we're consciously that we consciously realize and that we accept. This can, as far as I feel has been proven, been able to change only by individuals themselves doing it, but is able to undergo, from a process of trying to become aware of these things, some enactment of altering cognitive thought process, and also various other personality traits and characteristics, and a part of what's projected outwardly into our social environments from our own behavior. This can also, as far as our learning goes, in terms of intellectual capability and knowledge, anyone, as far as I'm concerned, no matter their disability or their background in life in terms of racial or ethnic heritage, cultural, gender, their sexual orientation, attraction, no matter what it may be, you are capable of understanding various other elements to your surrounding environment through learning. And I don't think that you can indefinitely say that someone cannot change their abilities, as I don't believe in pessimism, as I've explained in the paradox of pessimism. But in this regard, so we do have the ability to alter. I feel we do have the ability to try and learn and alter and develop our neurocortexes in various other ways, and this leads to, well, conceptual understanding of other, well, of things that we weren't aware of before. So in this sense, we have an ability to, by our own accord, determine at least an attempt to try and alter some part of our psychological and our cognitive abilities to some degree. But in relation to the fact that all of that is controlled by reactions of your nervous system from external stimuli in your surrounding environments, as causing internal reactions. Well, as far as I'm concerned, yes, it's a part of us. This is what is doing it. But if we look at this is basically a control mechanism, a center that's part of your physiology that is enacting these motions for you, these motions in our, well, physical existence, and how we how we exist in nature, how we act, and how we perceive things, our perceptions. This is all controlled by our neurocortexes. It's all headed by this organ system within our body structures. So even though what we describe in terms of, well, psychology and philosophy alike, and bridging it in the branch known as philopsychology, we know, so even though we have these things, yes, obviously describe what we are as people and what we choose to do, this is still technically controlled by an internal mechanism because of the psychological state, which is, again, as far as I'm regarding it, an internal mechanism controlled by our nervous system. We still are going, even those cognitive alterations, that's a reaction of the nervous system. That's a reaction of our critical thought process controlled by the prefrontal cortex, and as well as, in terms of learning abilities, the hippocampus, and frontal cortex for conceptual understanding. This is an attempt by our psychological state that's coordinated by these cortexes of the brain, because of neurons that have developed and grown and been produced as we've either matured, growing as we've grown, or again because of knowledge that we've gained from an experience that we've had and reactions that we've sustained to said stimuli. This is all controlled by these portions of the brain. So to say this, even those attempts at changing who you are, or making a decision, a critical decision on something, this is controlled by a reaction within our central nervous system. This is what then activates our psychological motives behind what we then choose to do, what we decide upon, what we choose to enact in our daily lives. This is exactly what is the controller of all of it. So if we look at it in that sense, technically, even though, yes, obviously our nervous system is a part of us, and our psychological state is a branch of the nervous system that's a part of us, we still technically, what we consider in a metaphysical sense as being our own choices that's projected outward in our social surroundings, is controlled by this one organ system that's within us. Like our speech, our articulation projected outward via responses within the parietal cortex, that's controlled as well by reactions within the pons and medullary axis for articulation of, well, the larynx and the voice box, that controls also our throat muscles and our jaw and our mouth muscles around here, or I believe it's called maxillofacial muscles, for speech and for communication. And our hand movements, everything that I'm doing right now, this is controlled by, well, coordination with the basal ganglia and our, well, spinal cord is a relay system for that, to the cerebellum for balance as well and motor coordination, to enact, well, these physical movements, which is controlled as an extension off of the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. So all of it is controlled by this one organ within our actual physiology. Same goes for our psychology. So by that notion, what we consider as being us and our social environments, what we're known for, our traits, our tendencies, our quirks, our interests, our beliefs, our moralities, our ideologies, this is all controlled by this one entity within our bodies. So when you look at it that way, technically we don't fully have free will. But again, with the contrary nature of it, we do at the same time. Okay. Let's go with another one here. So, something similar is, I brought this, I said I was only really going to do one from the last video that I talked about this in, but I'll bring up, I brought these up before, but I'll go into more depth. So, let's say you're ultra-capitalist, you're a mass corporate executive that actively has a monopoly over your employees' financial gain. You have complete systematic control over what is redistributed to them in terms of financial profit to gain needed survival resources in a capitalistic system of economics, which is, as far as I'm concerned, complete authoritarianism, and it's a branch of fascism. Now, in relation to this, the ideology of capitalism basically posits the idea of free market, a market that allows for a complete competition and self-determination amongst human beings in, well, a business sector for any gain and allowing for the privatization of resources to be obtained to either a single or few individuals who operate a set company or a business establishment of some kind, which it's also based on the idea of free trade amongst various amongst the competitors within the, well, business sector, at least in many regards, what was highlighted by Adam Smith. So, in this regard, the idea is that it is a completely deregulated system of economics and a societal structure that posits we operate solely independently, supposedly solely independently, for economic profit in this idea of individualistic strive for a meaning to life, basically, in the philosophical elements to the ideology. Well, as far as I'm concerned, if we look at the fact that, say, okay, let's look at on one hand what, as far as I'm concerned, the ideology completely allows within its dictations of principle. The idea of mass privatization, at least an idea of privatizing a portion of land or a facility for your own financial gain, or in terms of, let's say, go with copyright legalities, where you have the sole profitable rights to a piece of medium, of entertainment, of titling, a brand, a name, whatever else it may be. As far as I'm concerned, there is no ending in the ideology as to how much can be obtained by a corporate entity, and inevitably it leads to monopolies forming, a monopolization of, well, a higher-end economic, well, what it would become economic elites in a society who have gained mass control through pair deals or parental buy-ups of becoming the parent companies of various other corporate entities, which is completely within the ideological bounds of capitalism. And this is complete authoritarian control. And as well as, in that regard, what is allowed by the ideology in this regard, let's just go with this mass amount of amalgamation of privatization and extreme expansionism, let's say, of a corporate brand. Well, is this not an attempt at regulation of a system? The idea, so if we go with the idea that capitalism is based upon deregulation of economic finance and free flow of profits in, let's say, if there was a set trade currency, money, that was utilized to determine what is negotiated between sellers and buyers, the consumer and the provider of goods, it's negotiated with this trade currency what is bought and sold. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this is an attempt at systematic regulation. It's this in what is common, as far as I'm concerned, with mass amounts of high-end business elites who are ultra-rich and massively expansionize and gentrify lower-income communities. What goes on is that they essentially try to obtain as much, in terms of privatized land, as possible to set their corporate branches on, in terms of a corporate entity that has, well, mass expansionism. They try to place their services as far in range as possible, as a large amount of range, to, well, tailor the communities of these areas to be more incentivized to go towards purchasing their products. Mainly as well because, in terms of amalgamating mass wealth by doing this through, as far as I'm concerned, propaganda, advertisement, well, they then basically are able to amalgamate so much wealth that they are able to buy up a whole slew of stock supply of whatever the product they're selling is, a mass amount of control over the supply chain that actually distributes these things. So, well, they basically own the supply chain, so they don't have to worry about purchasing any more of the material now that they've amalgamated this mass amount of profit to be able to obtain it. So they then further try to expansionize and charge cheaper prices for their products to basically drive the profit towards their company, and in terms of a smaller community that is either heavily degraded in terms of, say, cultural expression or legal provisions, or just general financial gain in a capitalist system, well, they basically siphon away all the profit from that community, because most often, in terms of choosing to go with this ideology, which sadly everyone does, well, they basically have now, most of these smaller businesses, because of the mass, along with that, the mass taxations and profit siphoning from companies such as hydro companies, hydro and electrical, same thing. Hydro companies, water companies, central heating and coolant supply companies that run the mechanisms of, say, a facility that a business is in, or a house that someone is living in, and the land, or the real estate companies that have sold them the land, or if they're leasing a space, or they're renting it out, someone's leasing it to them, they're a landlord for this actual, well, property that they're on. All this other mass amount of free economics, like free market, well, as far as I'm concerned, most often they end up charging up high amounts of prices for their products just to make ends meet, to not only pay off these various entities that are capitalist entities siphoning away their needed income, but also to keep their own facilities running for distributing their goods and services. And what ends up happening is these mega corporations, because they've amassed this amount of whatever they're selling, they've amassed this amount of profit, and they've grown so large, a mass amount of privatization. Excuse me. Well, their goal is to just gentrify and siphon profit away from these smaller communities so that they can keep up their mass financial gain. They're incredibly selfish individuals, and also to prevent potentially another company in the local area growing a mass amalgamation of wealth. And in all of that, is that not technically a regulation of a system? You are trying to tailor the set economic means of functioning to your benefit. You are trying to set regulatory control over these communities in the mass expansionism that you're trying to create and gentrification that you absolutely participate in. And in that, when it grows so much, you've basically tailored the whole system to function to you, monopoly. And yeah, it's complete control. This is control over a system. It's not deregulation, it's regulation of something. Now, even in that, okay, let's say there wasn't a mass monopoly, let's go with the liberalism idea of, capitalism. You can pick either classical liberalism or neoliberalism, one of the two. But at the core premise of the idea of free trade market, let's go with the idea that, let's go with just the principles of capitalism in and of itself, not the corporations that actively privatize mass amounts of area and expansionize. Let's go with what's dictated in the ideology, even though that's dictated and that's completely fine by the ideology standards. As far as I'm concerned, this idea that you are allowed to have self-individual control over an established business as an employer who has opened up a trade for goods and services to be negotiated upon based upon your own set financial desires, prices, whatever you determine it to be. As far as I'm concerned, you're complete head control over policy making as well for your own establishment, and also being the head controller of the financial redistribution to those who are within your corporation, your company, who work under you with this so-called idea of equal opportunity to gain financial promotions, which is just a fucking disguised way of saying kiss up to your employer and basically just try and impress them to survive in the economic world. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, this is all an attempt at regulation. This is regulatory. This is not deregulatory. This idea that you have complete control over those within your establishment who work under your titling, and also for your distribution of what is set in terms of your demands for profit for the goods and services that you're providing. This is all control. This is not free. This is not free market. It's ironic, actually. Well, here's a bit of a contradiction in this regard. The term free market is authoritarian market. It's not fucking free market. It's not a free economic system. It's not freeing to people, as far as I'm concerned. It's an attempt at control. And it's monopolistic. And relating to the fact that I believe that capitalism is a form of fascism, it's superioritizing of the employer over the employee, and inferioritizing of, well, the employee, the working class, over those who are able to obtain mass economic profit and control of the policies within a company. It's fascism. Fascistic, it's part of the fascist ideology. Even though it's technically, actually, we could say capitalism was the first form of fascism, technically, as what was later defined more so as I would call blatant fascism and ultra-fascism by Mussolini, and outlined and further practiced by Adolf Hitler. So, that's a bit of an interesting notion that I haven't thought of before. So, there's that. But now, let's go to the opposite end of the political spectrum, political phi, from far right to maybe more moderate rightist to, let's say, rising leftist to far left, or moderate left, anywhere around there. So, let's go with the idea of, I guess, let's go with Marxism. So, I don't personally identify as a Marxist. I think I've said this before. I don't think I've made it as clear as I guess I'll make now, but I do not identify as a Marxist. I obviously participate in Marxist school of thought, and I obviously do agree with, and many of my own ideologies fall in line or are part of Marxist ideology. It has the elements of, obviously, just general left-leaning Marxist thought. Though I identify as currently. I'll talk about this in a video that I'm hopefully going to make once I get into Montreal soon enough. Well, right now, as far as I'm concerned, I politically identify as an anarcho-communist, social anarchist, a collectivist, an anarcho-maximalist, and an anarcho-situationalist, and in regards to that, ethical situationalist, in relation to ethical situationalism. I believe I mentioned about my examinations of the philosophy of situationalism in part 6 of my scientific proposals, where I was going to further examine it more. Well, I have, and I've come to conclusions about it, but that's for a different video. Anyway, so in where my ideologies fall, I would consider myself in my redesign of the spectrum, a rising leftist, more leaning towards far left, but not identifying as a far leftist. I don't believe in far left ideology overall. So, in relation to this, but here's in Marxist ideology, what is outlined? Well, it's obviously the philosophies and ideals set forth by Karl Marx. And he was one of the co-writers of the Communist Manifesto in relation to it, and he also published works such as Das Kapital and Capital and Wage Labor in the Working Class, the works of the German ideology, and he co-wrote the Communist Manifesto with ideologist and the political philosopher Friedrich Engels. So, in regards to this, but what is outlined a lot in Marxism is the idea of, a specific idea in relation of, implementations of economic socialism. And in regards to that, what he would carry in, the complete rule of the working class making the deciding factors of a society, and the idea that not only do they control the means of production completely, but within, if there was, say, a corporate entity, but the control of the working class, those who are part of the production and labor force of whatever facet of a society, having the policy control of what is decided upon and how their work is done, and having control as well over the deciding factors of what is best for the actual direction of the societal, well, populace, what is needed for the setting that they are in. And in relation to this, in working with economics in socialism, in the idea of basically redistributing needed resources based upon, well, what a group of people or demographic within a society actually needs, what their needs are for this, well, for in a communal setting. What do you need this? Well, then we redistribute this amount, and then maybe these people need this certain amount of resources, but then we distribute this amount here. Various amounts of people based upon what is needed for that group, which would then, in the relation to Marxism and in the ideology there, eventually, hopefully, in a setting of what Marx himself had believed, the idea of eventually getting to a point of state communism, the idea of, well, an almost equalized redistribution of needed resources once enough of the previous issues or needs of a certain demographic in a society were met in terms of redistribution of, well, goods and the services that we provide, that an equal amount would eventually hopefully take hold, where it would be the end result. And in this as well was also highlighted in relation to Marx's ideals of, well, implementation, the ideas of anarchist thought that him and Engels had. Basically, the end goal as well being, in terms of the dictatorship of the proletarian, if in Marx's idea of a state government, in his call for governance to some degree, believing that a governmental system could be helpful to the redistribution process of a society, well, the eventual abolishment of all governmental forces entirely, the hopeful end of any sort of regulatory legislative properties, any sort of judicial system, any sort of governmental control, the abolishment of an end goal, with the end goal as well in terms of an economic sector for the communal redistribution of goods and needs and services, being communistic ideology taking hold. So in regards to this, though, in relation to Marxism, Marx's own ideals, he did also believe in, to some degree, an uprising and revolution of the proletarian. Now, it's very clear as far as I'm concerned that he had more ideals, and very much he had ideals of violent revolution. It's very clear that he had this idea of a dramatic, if possible, overthrow of, well, the subjugative aristocrats and authoritarian elites of a society, and basically the seizing of control and power by the proletarian force and the working class. But here comes the contradictions. If we were to look at this, and because Marx himself in his writings outlined the idea of, in capitalism, causing in relation to psychology, the alienation and isolation of the working class and the depravity that they are put into and under working for a sole corporate entity. The mass, basically, loneliness that people are shoved into, which causes the mass psychological disorders, as far as I'm concerned, disruption, in my theories, of the 5 inherent human desires, disruption to your psychobiological desires, your wants, and basically causing the alienation of those working underneath singular or few within a company of some kind. So he was very aware, clearly, of the ideology, not the ideology, well, he was aware of the ideological isolation and degradation of a system as controlling as capitalism. is. So he was aware of the lack of understanding, the psychopathic personality traits that elites across the board, as far as I'm concerned, share, the lack of empathy, the lack of sympathy towards the working class. But in this regard, is his call to revolution, his idea of an overthrow and the complete control of the working class of a society, not technically alienation in and of itself? Because let's think about it. In this regard, in Marxist ideals, if there was to be, okay, your idea, let's go with the revolutionary idea of overthrow. And let's specifically go on the idea of violent revolution. Enacting violence upon your oppressor, as far as I'm concerned, this is to assert authority over the oppressor. This is to assert oppression over the oppressor. This is control. This is an attempt to overthrow and dictate the direction that a society should be going in. This is a want for change. This is a want to dismantle the forces that had already been set up by selective groups of people. But in this regard, this is to exert authority and destroy something that was set up. This is to degrade those who are at the top of a society. And in relation to this, if we're looking at class structures, because another part of Marxist ideology, and also just the ideology of, well, let's look at this separate in the economic ideology of communism. The idea of a class, of lack of classes, the idea of financial separation, class structuring in communistic and socialistic ideology, of redistribution methods of wealth, or if there wasn't, because I should probably highlight this for my, just a bit of a detraction here. For the longest time, I have been, when I was in my more libertarian mindset, when I identified as a libertarian, I've been looking at things in more of a, in terms of relation to socialism and communism. The ideas within a bit of a set of a minimalistic governmental system, and the ideas of, well, redistribution from a governmental force based upon the business sector in an economy of what industries there are within that are set up for distribution of services for, well, the populace. But as far as I'm concerned, well, obviously even without that, in a community setting as part of the economic sector in terms of that is the redistribution method of how goods and services are negotiated upon, and that obviously comes down to various portions of the community, so still technically based upon the business sector of that community that is within existence. But even so, I should highlight that for the longest time, I've been coming at it from a libertarian perspective, but not so much at all anymore. But in relation to this, so even the idea of a classless society, the destruction of financial separation, and the common redistribution of goods and survival necessities for sustaining our life, food, water, shelter, if need be, depending on the weather, clothing, but not always, nudist here, and medicines, treatments, psychological treatments, whatever else, the needs or transportation, all these things, the common just negotiation based upon collective work for a society. Well, in this regard, in the idea of the destruction of various classes in a society, and especially the downfall of elitism, is this not technically an annihilation of a demographic of people? No, I mean it. Before anyone in anyone of the leftist community starts going haywire in the comments. This video is supposed to be highlighting contradictions. Well, let's look at that. Let's look at the idea of dismantling elites within a society, the downfall of elites, of elitists. So, as far as I'm concerned, in my relation to my other theory of, well, the inevitable formation of culture from ideology in sociology and in philosophy, and specifically in phenomenology, how I do believe that cultures will inevitably form out of an ideology that has been created on a moral basis from an initial culture that had already existed. This forms a neoculture. And I have a diagram, again, that I will show in better lighting at the end of this video, along with all the rest, for better demonstration. So, in this regard, if we were going to follow my theory in this regard of that inevitable formation of culture from an ideology, well, then in a capitalist ideology, as far as I'm concerned, elitist culture exists, and there are elements and traditions that are practiced very clearly within these groups of people that are a cultural setting. So, if we were to argue this, then, as far as I'm concerned, the dismantlement of financial classes, the separation of class, this would lead to the annihilation of a culture. This would lead to the destruction of a people group and maybe their identity, if we're really going to look at it like that. And in this regard, I would say, yes, in my argument, this would be a beneficial, dismantlement of a culture. But regardless, it's still the degradation and dismantlement of a culture, which in terms of most leftist ideology, we know of the oppression of various other cultural and ethnic groups within various societies throughout history across the globe. We know of the mass effects of colonialism from white European powers across the African continent, the South American continent, North American continent, Eastern Asian continent, the Oceanic continent. We know of all of it. It's spread widely across the world. And in relation to this as well, we know of ethno-religious oppression of the Jewish population in Germany during the rise of the Nazi regime under Nazism, a form of fascism as well. And in terms of, we know of in terms of the expansion of the Russian Empire far long ago, that mass amounts of Siberian ethnicities and, further Russian and Eurasian ethnic groups were massively suppressed and flat out destroyed in many regards for their cultural practices. So in this regard, we would often argue that the destruction of culture is terrible. And I would agree, yes, to the non-problematic traditions practiced by various cultures, which I would argue in almost every culture, even the cultures obviously that form out of ideologies, which is mass amounts, there's at least one good element to them. Even elitist culture, one good element, one beneficial thing in there. One, at least, beneficial thing that is practiced amongst these people, that is actually beneficial to our socialization. So, in this regard, though, you have to acknowledge that if you're going to claim you want to stop the suppression of and the annihilation of various demographics, you can't fully word it that way as far as I'm concerned, because this is contrary. Because in dismantling these oppressive forces, or say in governmental regulation of a judicial system and mass communal policing, in republicanism in terms of set provisions and benefits provided in terms of policing regulations to those within who are citizens in a civicist way, those who are citizens of a nation state of any kind, and that provide mass policing provision for this. Well, in terms of, say, politicians for the governmental forces and the laws that are set up for legislature, well, to dismantle this, you're dismantling a people group. You're dismantling a demographic in a society that very clearly has its own practices and what's common amongst them depending on how the societal structuring has been set up. So, this is the destruction of a people group. If there was to become a point of a classless and stateless world, which I would argue is beneficial in the way that we describe things, obviously. But nonetheless, you're essentially still doing the same thing. And in relation as well, again, to Marxist theory, well, shit, I had it in my mind just a second ago. Oh, well, even in his ideas of just governmental, the idea of authoritarian governmental rule, the rule of the working class, well, this is to basically pit the resources of a society to one group of people. Now, most Marxists would probably argue, well, the working class is pretty well everyone underneath the capitalist dictators, the overlords of an economic sector. Well, I would argue otherwise. Technically, not everyone in the society works. Yes, they do say what could be considered work in and of itself, analysis of things in a social observation. If you mainly just live at home and you look after, say, family members or friends or things of the sort in your community, this could all be considered working class, technically, yes. But in regards to what is negotiated, I guess, in a more what Marx had outlined himself, I guess more so industrial workers to some degree, and also those underneath the mass, well, just the mass traditional business sector. Well, technically, not everyone does work, and not everyone needs to work, as far as I'm concerned. It's ludicrous to think that every human being needs to actually manufacture things for survival, needs to actually physically help in the manufacturing, or even idea input to creating resources and needed goods for our survival. You can just be a part of a society, and at that moment you don't need to, if you can't and you don't have any actual input to it, you know you don't, or if something that you would think would be beneficial, you don't need to. And I think as a human being, you still have absolutely all the right to be a part of that society and survive with us. But in this regard, and also in regards to Marxist-Leninism, or what I'm just technically just Leninism, the ideas outlined by Vladimir Lenin and the rise of the Russian Revolution. His idea of, literally, he had actually stated he wanted to achieve state capitalism in a possible attempt to hopefully amalgamate enough resources to redistribute in a nationalistic sense to the Russian, what was Russia at the time, the Russian Empire, what was falling apart as the Russian Empire at the time. Well, as far as I'm concerned, literally stating it right there, putting this mass amalgamation in Leninist thoughts of resources to this sector of, well, a portion of those in a societal setting who are at the helm of the redistribution process, to amalgamate this in a governmental setting for mass authoritarian control in a one-party state system, which the Soviet Union absolutely was, and it was Lenin's downfall, and also his whole ideology was egotistical and a downfall for him, and paved the way for Stalinism, which is just pseudo-capitalism. But anyway, this idea, is this not, in that regard, in Leninism, is that not just the mass amalgamation of resources by one sole entity, you know, kind of like capitalism, the thing that Lenin, which I do believe he actually did believe, he wasn't a posture, I don't think. He was incredibly psychologically, he was narcissistic as hell, incredibly egotistical, and some degree obviously sociopathic, but he was an incredibly tyrannical ruler who, his sense of self was through the roof as far as I'm concerned. He had he believed in this idea of communal redistribution and achievement of socialism. I do believe that, but he had a mass cognitive dissonance as far as I'm concerned, massively. He held two conflicting beliefs that really were not. They were 3 and -5 equaling 10. So basically, what I'm saying is, in this regard, that would be an amalgamation by one sole entity. You could technically look at it as basically a governmental corporation of resources within a nation for the potential of redistribution, but still the control. That redistribution is now at the control of this one entity, at least under Leninism, as far as I'm concerned. So, and in another one, in relation to leftist ideology, I'm going to go again here. In relation, because I brought this one up as well in the last time I talked about this, anarchism. The idea of anarchism is no set systematic regulation in terms of a governmental force. The idea that a community operates just in, well, what it goes about in terms of not setting any regulatory process in terms of a society to basically determine what is best to do for us at this current point in time, so that it can be freely molded and changed in what we go about in terms of our ideology of how we function in the community, to not actually exact force over those within a community, and on a more interpersonal level, philosophically, not exerting mass authority over those within your daily life, to basically let things be their choice and negotiate upon what is needed without any sort of no set dictation of understanding, I guess I would say, in a more relational dynamic, in relation to dynamics. But in this regard, if a community which did not have any sort of set legal system in regard functioning in anarchistic, community work, and how they function governmentally with no at all legislatively controlled or policed policies or things that are enforced by law or a military force of some kind. Well, if everyone was agreeing upon this set ideology to go about with this, is this not technically a set system? Is this not technically the set idea of us agreeing to go about this way? Is this not technically a system? And if we operate in, say, if they have a traditional form of operation with how they work and gain resources amongst a community, what they do on a daily basis, and it's all just known that these people do this and we do that, and then you do this and you can help with this, and we maybe shift positions, and people vary in terms of their work, whatever else. If we're all agreeing upon this and functioning in this way, has this not basically just become an unspoken regulated system? Has this not just become a system in its metaphysical self and physical self, in what we're enacting, just within our ontology, our existence within this community? Has this not become
just a set system with no just documents and papers just saying, yeah, we've signed this into legislature. We've signed this to decree it and decree that this is, and it's not policed. So is this not just a system now that's been established? So, okay, I'm going to bring up one more example that I brought up in the last video, and I'm going to move to the public library of the St. Dorothy district of Laval that I'm in, so that you can actually see my face better and bust out my new diagrams. Okay, I'm in front of the public library now, and well, the last thing I'll bring up for this is the aspect in philosophy or the study in philosophy of metaphysics or metaphysicalism, and its relation to how we perceive the surrounding world and our environment, and also in relation specifically to how we perceive psychology and the study of our emotional projections for our socializing behavior. So, the separation here is what it is in metaphysicalism. Metaphysicalism is the idea of there being an existence of properties amongst human beings and just the collective essence of nature itself, the rest of the animal kingdom, the plant life, the physical ecosystems themselves, call it physical, and the weather, meteorology. Let's say all of these combined elements, that there are properties that are presented to us and just the other beings inhabiting our shared existence, that there are things that are unspoken, that are, or even in spoken, say, language or communicated force, that are not technically physical, but they still have a tangible, measurable presence within our, conscious reality for all of us. That we all feel and understand these things that can't fully be articulated, described, but we understand them. At least to some degree we understand them, and we absolutely sense them, and and I'm not speaking, obviously, me being an agnostic atheist, I'm not speaking out of a spiritual sense here. I'm speaking purely out of the properties that aren't fully describable by human articulation and communication compatibility. What we know is real, what we know is a part of our, known world, but it's not physically, technically, grabbable. Here's an actual example, considering I'm standing right here. Okay, let's go with this pole in front of the library here. I can reach out, and I could touch that end, but it's rusty and ick. And now that I'm looking at you, I don't think I should be touching you. You might be very, very electrical. I have no clue. Okay, never mind. Different example. Let's say... Okay, let me go across the road here. Let's use this sign that's conveniently over here. I have no clue in terms of Canadian traffic law indication what this sign means. This yellow and black sign. Okay? Physically, I can reach out, I can touch it. It's something that my material hand, physiology, can touch, it can feel, it can grasp, I can cling onto it, I can do all that. all the sorts. It's something that is physically tangible. I can feel it with my bare hands. But what I can also feel, but I can't physically grasp, technically, is how the sign makes me feel. I can look at it and say, wow, that's a very pretty design. The black and gold sheen of it, and just the patterning of it being in a striped and a striped diagonal formation, and it going up in a pattern or downward, depending on what way you're looking at. I think it's very aesthetically appealing, and it's very pretty. That, and it's something that's emotionally soothing to me in that regard. That is metaphysical, or at least in philosophy, what we define as metaphysicalism. It's something that's there, that I feel, that is genuinely having an impact on me, but it's not something that I can tangibly fully grab. Or you can even say, like, the sign above it. Laval Stationnement Reservé. I believe that means that this parking area is reserved. From my stance, obviously, restrictions, control, and a governmental force, I hate that. I don't like that that sign is telling me to do that, telling me that this is reserved and it can't be used by anybody communally. I hate that. I really despise that. That's metaphysical. But again, if I wanted to, I could reach out and spank the sign all I want for being a bad sign. Yeah, or I could punch it. One way or another, that's physical. That's physicalism in the idea, well, in philosophical examination. So that's what at least it's defined as being. But again, the paradox of existence, or is it? And also just realizing that's the whole tagline for this theory here. It is this way, or is it? But okay, so in this regard, looking at metaphysicalism, we know that, well, it has a tangible effect on us, and just as I did there, I was able to measure it. I was able to measure my thoughts and feelings and its psychological impacts on me, and the process that was evoked from me looking at those signs. I was able to measure that and analyze it. But if we're looking at from the definition that I've given of psychology, our psychological state, our emotions, being completely controlled and headed by our neurocortexes, our nervous systems, and it's all being a reaction of our cerebrums and the central neurons within our physiology that control our emotional state. Well, and we know as well in this regard the physical problems that can come about from mass emotional disrupt. As far as I'm concerned, we know and have very clear proof that most physiological diseases and disorders are caused by psychological disorders. And also in relation to that, the societal problems in terms of the destruction of a physical environment or the unkept nature of something in a sociological setting. Well, how this can affect our physical health, which then can in turn also affect our psychological health. Well, we know that those societal issues are also most often caused, well, they are caused, it's not most often, they are caused. Scratch what I said about most often. They are caused by psychological trauma and issues, or detrimental beliefs and things of the sort. We know this, as far as I'm concerned, and people really just deny it. Or they don't actually bother to listen to competent scientists. But in this regard, so we know that metaphysical problems have a physical effect on us in relation to how we feel. And in this regard, this can cause, say, well, physical pain, psychosomatic issues, pain that isn't caused by actual physical deterioration, at least what we consider physiological, as well as a relation to mass palpitations of the heart in relation to high amounts of anxiety, as well as shortness of breath in relation to hyperventilating, and also digestive upset and nausea relating to that, fear in relation to a fear response, as well as lowered ability of critical thought in relation to, well, our psychological essence. But anyway, I think you get what I'm trying to say here, is that a lot of this has an effect on our physical well-being. All of it does. It has an effect on us. It absolutely has an effect on our immune health, our immunal health, for our autoimmune systems, and how our actual body processes and fights off various pathogens that could be causing us issues. And we know that mass amounts of immune disorders are linked to psychological disorders. Basically, the body, in terms of our neurocortexes and the proteins that are a part of our brain structures that are there, a part of the immune system to protect from harmful pathogens, well, in relation to us basically having so much disrupt to our 5 inherent desires and denying it, as far as I'm concerned, in relation to internalized things such as internalized depression, paranoia, psychosis, and internalized anxiety in terms of mental disorders, as well as disrupt to human socialization in relation to personality disorders like sociopathy, egotistical personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, all things of the sort. All these things, basically our immune system begins to actually attack our own physiological process. And that includes starting with issues detected within the nervous system. We know that, as well as relating to cancer development and oncology, a lot of cancers we know in relation to societal issues, pollution, mass amounts of artificial flavonoids and preservatives and growth hormones put into our foods by mega corporate entities to save on fucking a couple $100, or for them what would be nothing, absolutely nothing, with the mass amount they obtain financially and things of the sort. And also pollution amounts in the air, mass amounts of fossil fuels, overproduction of carbon emissions going into the air, high amounts of just overproduction and overconsumption. All of this is, and deforestation, lack of production of oxygen created by the tree life. This all has physiological implications, and this has been linked to various cancers developing within our bodies, and, well, the dying of cells and causing mass amount of cell clusters to form and spread and deteriorate the rest of our cell compounds within a certain organ system. All of this can be traced back to psychological disorder. And in this regard, if we know that this has mass amounts of physiological implications, as well as what we produce in our societies in terms of our, well, the building, what inspires us to build structures, designs, cars, make artistic creation, whatever it may be, is this not all technically physicalism? Is this not technically a physical process going on here? Because as far as I'm concerned, if it has this amount of an effect over what we consider to be our material essence in the world around us, then this would be enough to constitute things such as psychology in relation to how our emotional process works and is projected amongst people in socialization, philosophy in relation to ontology, our whole existence and how things exist within their nature, phenomenology, how different phenomenons take on across different populaces throughout history, and different trends that have come about in why human beings desire these things in existence, epistemology of our intellectual process relating to what is considered intellectual thought or what is considered to be intelligent, what we think of as being intelligent ideas, morality, ethics, what is considered to be socially acceptable, a beneficial or detrimental thing to act upon in our social settings, and what we believe is better for us to do or worse for us to do. All these things are, in aesthetics, what we feel to have some sort of representation or meaningfulness in, what we design, wear, create, design and create. Or in axiology, what we believe is the inherent meaning of things and the inherent worth of things within their physical existence, and in relation to metaphysicalism, metaphysical existence, the inherent worth, not assigned worth, based on human social constructs. But in all of this, it has these mass effects to what we clearly feel, and which forces us to physically act upon things. Let's say if someone was to have a violent outburst because of aggressive behavioral disorder that had formed, because of mass amounts of years of interpersonal trauma caused by a certain portion of the cultural setting that they were in, or maybe trauma initiated to that initial culture. And this is what caused this to happen, why they lashed out in a violent outburst. But this is a physical reaction. They're trying to attack somebody or something. They're punching an inanimate object, basically. So, if it has these effects, then, as far as I'm concerned, in the process of neurology, this is physical. And in this regard, yes, I consider myself a physicalist. I do obviously use the term metaphysical and metaphysicalism to describe how these processes work, but as I highlighted in my implementations for different scientific fields in part 5 of this series, in relation to philosophy and specifically metaphysics, the only reason I believe that we consider things to be metaphysical is because we do not actually have the articulation ability neurologically to actually communicate completely what we truly desire or mean by these, what we desire out of life and what we actually mean by these words we're using. We don't have the ability to. It's not within our physiological process. And in regards to this, I also, this is quite literally why the paradox of existence even exists in the first place. As far as I'm concerned, the only reason this theory here is truthful, from my observations, is because we don't have that ability. And that's also why interactive loneliness exists, as far as I'm concerned, in our psychological state, in terms of the subconscious. We don't have the ability to fully articulate what we want. We don't have the ability to, or in terms of physical communication, sign language, or just physical representation in some way, physical movement, we don't have the ability to fully convey what we really deep down desire. We don't have the ability to do so. And that is the only reason that we consider things to be metaphysical. Because as far as I'm concerned, in relation to how it actually affects us, everything is physical. And in this regard, that's the only reason that the paradox of existence is true. Okay, so in this regard,
I can't talk to people anymore, I swear. Wait, what did you just say? It's like that. People who believe in first. I have rage against this stuff. No! Because you don't understand. I asked you. You're focusing on my phone. Answer what I asked.
well, seems like I'm not the only one having a philosophical debate tonight. And in relation to them, not with myself, I guess. I'm also having a bit of a... Well, actually, this is what I'm looking at with these two people here. This is, I think, an example of disrupt to 5 inherent desires. Both are not understanding each other, it seems. But, okay. To cap this video off, I'd just like to say a few things. So, and also I will show my diagrams that I have made. So, in relation to first my diagrams, I'm going to repost them to the communities tab. I'm obviously keeping the initial post that I had for the diagrams that were there, so you can observe them and see how they've evolved. And so with these new ones that you can review them again at your own will, I highly encourage you to do so and share your thoughts on it in the comments of the tabs. And in relation to that, I've created, like I said, 2 new ones. But so I'm going to post those to the communities tab, and I would like everyone watching to please go and review those, new and the old, both. And well, I'll just say today has been a mixed bag. I know I started off the video saying that I wasn't in the best of moods. Now, coming down from my little back and forth with myself, I'm still not. So, obvious, in the midst of filming this, I got diarrhea. Not fun. Not a fun gastrointestinal reaction. And well, in the midst of that, my tripod was stolen. Fantastic. But you know, after I'm done filming this, I'm actually going to go see if I can offer my services to their little dilemma if they'd like. In terms of being a medic, psychological services. If they're still there once I'm done. But, okay. And on top of that, I talked about in the last, well, not the last video, when I was in southern half of St. Martin in Pletchmont Repose, and I filmed the video of me talking about my travel stories. And I know I mentioned here and there, and I mentioned in my 5th part actually of the scientific proposals about the announcement of me going to be getting into doing sensualistic pornography, pornographic video making, whilst getting into Quebec. Now, I had initially, and I believe I mentioned this here and there, I had initially planned to, once I got to around the greater Montreal area here in Laval, I had decided that I was going to try to maybe start that up whilst in Montreal or in Longueuil if I once I end up leaving Montreal. And sorry, just one sec. Okay, so I initially thought about that, but considering where my finances are at right now, I have decided that I'm going to begin my pornographic videography making once I get back up to northern Laval, the northern end of Jesus Island. And in doing that, I figured, well, whilst I'm here in St. Dorothy, that I would try to sign up on Pornhub, the pornographic distribution platform that I will unfortunately be using. I tried to sign up for the modeling program, and it took a long ass time, and it was an infuriating process, and I am still not completed because of their performative nonsense in relation to trying to keep clean with the idea of being this so-called prestigious adult entertainment platform. They have put in new regulations for verification and authentication of users coming in, well, model users who are making profit off of the actual platform because of, well, issues with deepfakes and things of the sort in terms of AI generating systems, which has caused a mass amount of issues, as I'm really starting to realize, as I've had to now download a separate app to basically verify all my information needed to be provided to Pornhub's authentication process. So I went through that. That took maybe an hour, and then it was still giving me issues, and I had to do a face scan, and then I had to take a photo of some of my provincial IDs, which I haven't used yet. And long story short, I'm stuck at a point where I tried accessing the next step of the application process, and it said camera accessibility for the platform is not enabled. You'll need that for uploading videos. And I was like, okay, well, I'll try and turn it on. I tried looking that up, and I did so, and it told me again that it wasn't enabled, and I was like, fuck if it isn't, you idiotic programming system. It is enabled. It bloody well is. And so I tried another method, and it didn't work. And I was getting blasted and infuriated because of the idiotic amounts of regulation and authentication to go through this. I think you already, if you saw the ending bit of of exploring Gatineau Part 3, go watch that if you haven't. You know my thoughts now on things such as legal regulation, and that includes sexually explicit content. Unfortunately, I don't think it can be controlled. Anarchist, hello. And basically, I was like, fuck it, I am contacting Pornhub support team for the modeling program. And I contacted them. They sent me back a very obviously pre-typed out digital message that they obviously send off to all their users and their models and their staff, whoever else has a problem with it. It was clearly I was not speaking to a real human being, which I would have liked to, and they don't have a support line where I can call it, which I wanted to do, but I couldn't. So I ended up messaging them, and then I was like, you know what, fuck it, I'm doing this another day, because long story short, being in public, even on various Wi-Fi networks, I don't exactly, technically I do, but I don't typically access Pornhub all too often, or at least whilst being out in the open, in broad daylight. without my phone screen turned to very minimal brightness. So, it was infuriating. And along with that, right as I was getting to the process of opening this new app to put all my verification and identification into it, to try and then go back into the goddamn platform to enable this shit, I got a message from an American friend of mine living in the United States, a longtime friend of mine. And they have been having a lot of troubles recently. One of their parents was diagnosed with cancer not too long ago. Possibly ovarian cancer, because they had found an initial biopsy of their ovaries. They had found one of the main cluster cells in there, but they didn't know if that was where it originated, the spreading of the actual cancer mass. And then they started chemotherapy. And I tried asking when I was in Wi-Fi during my first few bits of travels here how they were doing. They weren't very responsive in depth. And yesterday I got a text from them, and it read, because I asked how their parent had been doing, and they said, the cancer has spread to their lungs and become terminal. So, that's not good at all. That's horrible. And then I got a message today, and I asked if they wanted to get on a call to be able, when I was in Wi-Fi, to do long distance. And they told me possibly tomorrow. And then as I was going through this process of trying to sign up as a model member for Pornhub's revenue program for actually uploading to the site, I get a text and it says they have 24 to 48 hours to live. Or at least that's the diagnosis that the oncologist has given them. As you can imagine, well, I'm sure you can. And, well, I didn't have anything I thought I could say to them that would be really helpful in the moment. And I just told them, I will let you process this. And once I'm in Wi-Fi again, just text me when you want to try and talk on the phone. If you want to, and hopefully I'll get the message when I'm in Wi-Fi again, because I will be leaving the district of St. Dorothy and heading into West Laval tomorrow, most likely. And on top of that, that's not the only problem going on with them right now. They're one of their grandparents is currently experiencing stage 1 Alzheimer's dementia. That is also horrific. As, well, on this channel, you know. Or if you just have general knowledge of neurology. And another one of their grandparents has severe cystic fibrosis that is destroying the air sacs of, well, their pulmonary function. And it will become terminal at some point. If it hasn't already, and if it's not already considered terminal. So That's why I was not in a very good mood. But, interestingly enough, on top of that, a very, very kind thing happened today. I went and did some grocery shopping at the same time as I was trying to sign up for, well, Pornhub's program. And I was carrying my groceries in a box. It was a large amount. And as I was walking past the gas station in the main area of St. Dorothy, down in the southern half, close to the southern half at least, someone at this gas station, as they were filling up, saw me, I guess somewhat struggling, and they started talking to me in Quebecois French, but then I said, je ne sais pas français, anglais, and they were like, you speak English? And I was like, yes, and then they were like, where are you headed? And I was like, oh, just up to the northern end of the district a bit, just carrying some groceries. And they were like, I'm going to drive you. Really? And they were like, yeah, I want to drive you. It's way too much for you to carry. I didn't ask. They just offered. And I was like, absolutely. So I got in their car, and they drove me up, and they were incredibly friendly, incredibly compassionate. And they asked me where I was initially from, because I guess they noticed my Southern Ontarian accent. And I said Toronto, and they asked, well, why was I here in Laval, Quebec, and travels, things of the sort. I eventually told them that I'm going to be heading up to Lévis in Quebec City at some point, and they told me about an area that's close to, I can't remember the name of it, close to Quebec City, that's very beautiful in their opinion, but I should check it out once I'm there. So they dropped me right in front of the church over here, and I thanked them profusely, and they went on their way. Like, they just saw me struggling, and they offered to help. That brightened my day up. And that's what I've mainly been focusing on cognitively, mentally, for a lot of this day, despite all the other issues. So, let me quickly show you my diagrams, and then sign off this video. Okay, I'm just going to zoom in on these for better lighting. So, this is the this is the diagram outline of the 5 inherent human desires in relation as well to biologic thanatophobia and interactive loneliness. I will let you review it at your will. Again, you can pause this here, take a look at it. Okay, so there's that. If I can actually hit the pause button. The process of suicidality/suicidal ideation. I already talked about all of these. I already talked about in my initial 5 scientific proposal videos, so go watch those. Yeah, major depressive episode leads to suicidal onset, which then leads to a process of suicidal actualization, typically rising in severity, considered to be anything that reaffirms an individual's desire for suicide, with a determining suicidal actualizer, which I call the trigger, which then leads into the process of suicidal confirmation, the full want to actually enact self-murder, and the determining suicidal actualizer, as far as I'm concerned, is what's most readily focused on in the process of suicidal confirmation, which can either lead to an interference of, well, the whole process entirely, and then, well, it being resolved, or if later relapse occurs back to a major depressive episode, or the actual successful death of an individual. So I'll let you pause that to take a further look at it. The political phi/political fest spectrum. This is my redesign of, well, the operations and orientations of what we consider to be the spectrum of politics and political identity and sociology. It operates not on the shape formation of a straight horizontal line, but as far as I'm concerned, it operates in that of a shape of a, well, Greek phi letter or a Russian phe letter shape. So with a gray area between, well, the morality and moral ideals of both the lower end of the spectrum and the upper end. So if you can see it well enough, I will let you review that at your will. And yeah, there's that. The inevitable formation of culture from ideology. So, starting with initial culture, there is a bridge between that and the new forming ideology on the basis of a moral principle and the methodologic basis of, well, how it's enacted. This leads to the formation of said ideology, then the formation of new traditions, as far as I'm concerned, leading to a neocultural development out of, well, elements of the original culture itself, but primarily the newfound ideology. And in relation to that, the neoculture adopts certain aspects of the original cultural traditions, and then even the initial culture, as far as I'm concerned, in many cases, adopts the newer aspects of the neoculture with it as well. So yeah, I will let you pause that to read. Okay. The ripple perspective. Yeah, every choice you make matters and has an effect on the external environment around you and your interpersonal life. That is, as far as I'm concerned, definitive in that regard. Yeah, pause it and read it at your will. That's all I have to say about it. And now for the two new diagrams that I've created. So this is the one for the unempathic, unsympathetic cycle of conflict. And let me quickly explain it. You have the oppressed, which is individual and collective amongst a group of people, and also just, well, in relation to a sole person. And you have an inaction because of authoritarian subjugation from your oppressor, individual and collective. This authoritarian subjugation comes from a conscious reaction in terms of our psychological state, what we desire to enact upon the oppressed, which then, as far as I'm concerned, reaffirms this ideal of authoritarianism to a counteraction, which then leads to suppression of the oppressor, which basically you can flip these entirely around, which they then become the oppressed in that scenario, and then the other becomes the oppressor. And in relation to this authoritarian subjugation and, well, just authoritarian conflict on both ends leads to a relay to the subconscious of each individual psychological state. There is a mite crawling across the paper, who cares? And this disrupts the five subconscious psychobiological desires of, well, each individual person within said group and how it affects them in a societal setting. This then leads to a disruptive pro-socialization for both the oppressor and the oppressed, and based on the reactions that are triggered. And this then leads to a two-way streak of sociopathic/dismissive anti-socialization, as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, you can pause to read that, and yeah, on to the last one. Okay, and the last one for coming morality formation, and as far as I'm concerned, this is the best diagram I've bloody well drawn so far. So, yeah, your entire environment affects you. You have an individual's philopsychological state and how it is in its, well, own essence, and it's influenced by your interpersonal life, the societal, and a part of that, the cultural and the ecological systems around you. And they all obviously affect each other within the set, well, surroundings within an environment. And this then leads to a mental influence over the psychological, philosophical ideals of an individual, which causes the formation of a cognitive ethical compass of their own individual right, whether they're aware of it or not, which then leads to your ethical decisions in everything you do and every decision you make and how it influences the surrounding environments within your, well, wherever your set location is, physical and metaphysical. So, pause this to read it at your will, and these will all be in the Communities tab of this channel. So please just review them. And yeah, that's it. I hope you learned something from this video, and all the rest that I've made if you've watched this far. Let's hope I get the issues with Pornhub resolved so that I can actually start uploading videos to it. And I hope my friend, well, I hope they're seeing some amount of hopefulness in their very much horror show of a scenario right now. Good night. Wow. Deja vu. Well, no point in sticking around here, I guess. Before going, I just take notice. I'll slap this on at the end. This poll seems to be, well, some very lovely messages written on it, like, fuck Azerbaijan, fuck Aliyev, fuck China, fuck Turkey, free Palestine. Okay, that actually might, to some degree, explain some of the, oh, no, well, fuck Black Lives Matter, and fuck Parti Québécois, fuck René Lescure. I think I know who that is. That might be a Quebec provincial senator. And this might either be, well, it just says Armenia. It might be an attempt at drawing the Armenian flag, or the Armenian Revolutionary Movement flag. Well, this might have been in protest of, well, I believe it would be well, the ongoing cultural genocide of the Armenians in territory taken up by Azerbaijan, possibly. And in terms of the free Palestine, well, I think that's obvious in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But either way, not a very friendly poll, I'd say, for messaging. Okay, I'm going back to the public library. Fuck this, I'm too tired to care.